Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Battle for Azeroth class review. Today we are going to be tackling the Mage. You know, exiting Legion, it's perhaps one of the best established specs in the game, so Blizzard have instead, they've focused on moving on from the artifact weapon system successfully, while also making some targeted tweaks to the baseline gameplay of each spec. No massive revamps, but still a fair few changes to cover in this video, which has been sponsored by and made with the help of Icy Veins. They're the largest destination for World of Warcraft class guides, and they've recently hired 26 writers for BFA. They're putting a tremendous amount of effort into having their class guides being good to go for the pre-patch, and you'll find all that stuff linked below. And they've also been a tremendous help in making this series, and of course it's a site that I myself have been using for years. So a big thanks to them. And let's start off with the Arcane Mage, which was one of the most unique specs in Legion in my book. Blizzard changed its relationship with mana, creating a spec that was all about timing how it burnt through its mana bar, with the spec essentially going through burn phases of super heavy damage and then conserve phases of quite a bit lighter damage, with a pace that's all being dictated by evocation, which is a cooldown that would fully replenish your mana bar over its duration. BFA makes a few tweaks to the formula, so let's check them out. The arcane rotation is pretty much the same, but it has been tweaked to make it a bit less reliant on arcane charges. How? Well, Arcane Missiles and Arcane Explosion no longer have their damage being impacted by arcane charges, and you can cast Arcane Missiles at any time. Now, they both deal strong damage, but they don't play a role in arcane charges at all. So you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, it means that you can, say, cast Arcane Missiles at the expense of quite a lot of mana when you have no arcane charges, and that's a way of you just doing strong, immediate damage that's completely not relying on you building up any resource. Now, going into the Arcane Missiles changes a little bit more. So back in Legion, you could, you get your charges of Arcane Missiles from doing other spells. It was a 15% chance to proc a charge for most spells, or 30% through Arcane Blast. Now, this has been removed, and it has been replaced with a new passive that is called Clear Casting. So Clear Casting makes your next Arcane Missiles or Arcane Explosion free, and in the case of missiles, channel 20% faster. It has a 1% chance to proc for every 100 mana that you spend, and this means, of course, that it's going to be happening more often during your burn phase, because that's when you're spending more mana. Now, Arcane Blast costs 2,750 mana when at 4 charges, which equals a 27.5% chance, but at 1 charge it only costs 550 mana, so a 5.5% chance. Now, your conserve phase normally takes you up to 4 arcane charges, which makes a 27.5% chance of an Arcane Blast, giving you clear casting. So that's what's going on overall. It won't feel massively different, though you will be seeing less procs of the ability than previously. You see, by making it a proc that's based off mana spent, it does mean that your free Arcane Missiles, because of clear casting, well, they won't generate another clear cast because they're not spending mana, so you won't be chaining procs of this together. So that's kind of what's up with the clear casting and arcane charges situation. It feels maybe a little bit weaker when things are going well, but the ability to do decent damage regardless of arcane charges in both single target and AoE, I suppose that is quite welcome. Now, arcane charges also decrease the cast time of Arcane Blast, which is quite nice, and the baseline mana regeneration actually feels it's quite a lot faster than it was in Legion, which makes aspects of the spec a little bit less punishing. So with all that covered, let's just talk about the baseline gameplay and what all of this stuff actually means. So if your cooldowns are ready, then it's probably time to hit the burn phase. So you're going to be burning through your mana bar by constantly casting Arcane Blasts. Of course, every Arcane Blast generates a Arcane Charge, capping up at 4, and each Arcane Charge increases the mana cost of Arcane Blast and decreases its cast time. So you'll, of course, while you're doing this, you'll be generating clear casts, so you'll be firing off the Arcane Missiles. When you're out of mana, then you'll likely use Evocation to get back up to full mana, and then you'll be playing for time until your cooldowns are back, and really that's called the conserve phase. So during the conserve phase, you want to burn down to about 50% mana and sort of hover about there such that you can pop Arcane Power and then burn down to 0 mana during its duration, then immediately evocate back up to full. It's pretty much the arcane that you know, but some of the talent tweaks are important, so let's get into them now. Starting off with tier 15, we've got Rule of Threes. It's a new one, and it's pretty cool. It makes your third Arcane Charge make your next Arcane Blast free. Now, this is a massive reduction in mana spent, and it pretty much means that doing 5 Arcane Blasts in a row is kind of mana neutral, especially if you get a clear cast proc. This opens up your conserve phase to being a little bit more aggressive, though we do need to talk about some other talents before I get into how that's important. Now, you also have Amplification, which causes clear cast Arcane Missiles to fire an additional missile, so pretty simple, some more damage, damage, then Arcane Familiar is the same as it was in Legion. Now the 30 tier is effectively the same, with the only difference being that Slipstream now only allows movement during a clearcast Arcane Missiles, which kind of makes sense because Arcane Missiles otherwise was not usable in Legion. Then the 45, 60, and 75 tiers are unchanged. You're probably going to end up going with like Charged Up and Rune of Power in those tiers. Now thankfully the 90 tier has new stuff. Erosion and Unstable Magic, which were both kind of boring, well, they're gone. Reverberate is a new talent that gives you a 50% chance to generate an arcane charge if your arcane explosion hits 3 or more targets. Then Touch of the Magi is an artifact trait that has been brought over. It gives Arcane Blast a 10% chance to apply a debuff to the target. This debuff stores 20% of the damage you do to the target over 8 seconds, and then it explodes, dealing that built-up damage to nearby enemies. And this works quite well with Rule of Threes, because Rule of Threes allows you to get a bit more aggressive during your conserve phase, which means that you can better take advantage of a Touch of the Magi being on the target, which is pretty cool. And then Nether Tempest has been unchanged, and then we move over to the 100 tier. Overpowered and Arcane Orb are the same, they're unchanged, but Time Anomaly is a new talent that replaces Temporal Flux. It's really strange and random. You can get either one of 3 effects just randomly, so you can get 4 Arcane Charges, 10 seconds of Arcane Power, which is a big cooldown, or 1 second of Evocation. And these just happen at random times. It could be a great time or a bad time. As an example, getting 4 Arcane Charges is useless when you already have 4 Arcane Charges. It's kind of hard to play around it, and it's meant to be something that you just react to, but I just found it to be really annoying. Getting an Evocation midway through your burn phase doesn't matter because you're planning on doing an Evocation anyway, and it just kind of serves to throw you off the rotation, which, isn't great because this is a spec that's all about lining up cooldowns. Now, one talent combo that I did find to be interesting was Rule of Threes and Overpowered. You see, Overpowered makes it that you only need 30% of your mana bar for the burn phase, if you're doing it sort of right or doing it best, and then Rule of Threes allows for your conserve phase to be a little bit more aggressive. And if you play with the two of these, it's actually kind of freeing. I suppose it does make the spec a bit less punishing in some ways, but another way to think about it is that the spec is now more flexible in Battle for Azeroth. So what's my overall opinion? Well, there's some fun talent combos actually that I really like. I think Rule of Threes is a really fun talent. The core gameplay of lining up all of your cooldowns and all of that stuff, it is there, and it's one of those specs where it does just need a few simple buttons, because a lot more of its complexity is based on how do you line up your Rune of Power with your arcane, your arcane power, and putting all of those things together right, and also making it fit with the fight. I think that by making some of the spec a little bit less punishing, maybe that will be unfortunate for the people who enjoy the top end of the gameplay, but for the majority of players, I think it will open up the sort of core unique selling point of this spec, which is the conserve phases, the burn phases, its mana bar. It'll open that up to more people. It doesn't really seem like that much of value has been lost, though I know some people are not particularly happy about losing the Aluneth ability. Overall, basically for me, it is the Arcane that you knew from Legion, but it has some talent options that I prefer a little bit more, and it's still something I would be perfectly happy to play, but not as much as the 2 other mage specs, which I love quite a bit more, so let's move on to them. And we're going to first tackle the Frost Mage. I think it's fair to say that the Frost Mage was one of the best realized specs in Legion in terms of what it wanted to do. It really was a spec, it knew it was proc madness, and it executed that quite well. It was a fast-paced spec that had a great sense of pace with plenty of procs to react to, but in such a way that you didn't feel that constrained by the randomness, because really the law of averages was applying a lot with it. I found the spec to be immediately quite enjoyable and satisfying in the long term, so it's hardly surprising that when we move into BFA, it focuses on tweaks and small changes rather than revamps. So because of the amount of changes that they're doing and how it's not tremendously large, we're going to be breaking the format slightly, and I'll mainly just be focusing on the key changes that have been made to the baseline of the spec. So let's talk about the baseline gameplay and tweaks. We still do have our usual set of core abilities. You've got Frostbolt, Ice Lance, and Flurry. Ice Lance deals extra damage to frozen targets, which is great, but what matters is the procs, which I'm going to reiterate here because I think they're really important to understanding the spec and this video. So Fingers of Frost causes Ice Lance to hit the target as if the target was frozen, which means triple damage. Brain Freeze then causes your next Flurry to be instant and deal extra damage, and apply Winter's Chill to the target. Now Winter's Chill will cause the target to take take damage from spells as if the target was frozen. Now, a consequence of this is that using a Fingers of Frosted Ice Lance on a Winter's Chilled target makes no sense. But what does make sense is using an Unfingers of Frosted Ice Lance on a target with Winter's Chill. Now, the really cool thing here is that Flurry is a projectile with speed, and it works out such that if you cast a Frostbolt and then immediately cast Flurry, the Flurry will hit the target before the Frostbolt, which means the Frostbolt will arrive after the target has got Winter's Chill. Now, why does that matter? Well, you've got a thing called Shatter. Shatter increases the crit damage of abilities against frozen targets by 1.5, and it increases the crit chance by 50%. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I re-explaining this stuff? Well, that's because BFA changes up the proc rate. So the proc rate of Brain Freeze is up to 25% from 15. Now this offsets the loss of Clarity of Thought, which was an artifact trait which brought it up to 21% previously, but as you can see, it still is a little bit of a buff, though the Frost Mage mains were probably putting more into Clarity of Thought anyway with the relics. But anyway, then the proc chance for Fingers of Frost has been changed. Previously it was 12% on Frostbolt and Frozen Orb. Now it's 15% on Frostbolt and 10% on Frozen Orb. Then Frozen Orb, of course, it's a cooldown, while Frostbolt is a regular ability, so this means that you'll be having more Fingers of Frost being shifted into the regular rotation single target. For the most part, this ensures that your proc rates still feel at a baseline quite good as you move from Legion over to BFA, though we do lose the ability to have 3 charges of Fingers of Frost because that was an artifact trait. Now your Mastery Icicles has been tweaked, now generating Icicles from Flurry and increasing the damage of Frozen Orb as well. The Icicles themselves can crit like normal spells, which technically means that the Icicles hit harder on a frozen target because they can shatter, which is kind of interesting. But that's really the core changes. Really, it's just some sort of behind the scenes tweaks to make it all work. So let's talk about the tweaked talents. So the first row is quite similar, having a nerfed Bone Chilling and Lonely Winter, with Ray of Frost being moved over to the 100 tier and Icy Nova taking its place. Ice Nova. Now, Ice Nova is a ranged ability that deals 4 times damage to the primary target and freezes targets for 2 seconds, meaning they would be set up for taking an Ice Lance to the face, assuming it was a freezable target. It's also pretty handy utility. Then the 30 tier is the same, bar Shimmer, which has a 5-second increased recharge. Then 60 is interesting because of Frozen Touch. It used to increase the proc rate of Fingers of Frost by 40%, but it now has been extended to also cover Brain Freeze. So the new version of this increases the proc rate of both Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze by 20%. Now this interacts quite well with the baseline proc changes to this spec, which are overall quite high as we enter BFA. Then Chain Reaction is a new talent that is inspired by an artifact trait. It causes Ice Lances against frozen targets to increase the damage of Ice Lances by 3% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times for a total of 15%. So really, it's just a simple buff to maintain, and it really shouldn't be too hard to maintain because realistically it's not like you're not going to be Ice Lancing the target. So yeah, that's what's up there. And then Ebon Bolt rounds off the tier and it operates as it did in Legion. Now over to the 75 tier we see no changes, and on the 90 tier Freezing Rain has been moved over from your artifact, and Splitting Ice now causes Ebon Bolt to cleave. Then on the 100 tier it's mostly the same, but Comet Storm has been moved down to the 90 row and Ray of Frost takes its place. Now Ray of Frost also now generates 2 Fingers of Frost over its duration, which kind of elevates it in power to be worthy of the 100 talent tier, and also makes it a little bit more interactive with the other mechanics of the spec, whereas previously it was quite standalone. So what are my overall thoughts here? Well, this is very similar to the Legion version of the spec. Blizzard have taken care to ensure that you don't really feel the loss of your artifact by baselining the increase in proc rate for Fingers of Frost and Brain Freeze, as well as making, Frozen Touch also affect Brain Freeze. The new Ray of Frost, to me, feels a good bit better because it integrates with the other mechanics of the spec, which is definitely a nice touch. And really, yeah, it's the Frost Mage that you know from Legion. If you loved it in Legion, you should love it here. It's pretty much back. Of course, we've got some changes like Ebon Bolt's not baseline, but still we do have a slightly higher proc rate for some of our main mechanics, and we've got a greater generation of Icicles, which speeds up the gameplay if you go for the Glacial Spike talent somewhat. Now, getting a Glacial Spike Flurry combo is actually a lot more likely now, and it's still super satisfying to execute, so I've had a lot of fun with that. Then, of course, the mobility of this is lovely, because while Frostbolt is a hard cast, your Flurry and your Fingers of Frost, they all, they're instant, so you can cast them while you're moving. Now, with Ice Flows and Shimmer, you really are very mobile as a Frost Mage, which is quite fun and empowering. So overall, Frost Mage, yeah, if you liked it in Legion, you're going to like it in Battle for Azeroth, and I think the changes that they've made have been good ones, so really it's only getting better. And then we move on to Fire. Oh boy, Fire has had a strong identity for a long time. I think it was tremendously fun in Legion, a lot like with Frost, and it hasn't seen massive changes. Instead, Blizzard are implementing a few targeted tweaks to ensure that it works without an artifact weapon, and they have included a few of its more successful legendary item effects into the talent tree. So we're going to kick it off with the baseline changes. And normally there would be a lot to talk about here, but there really isn't. If it's not broken, don't fix it, I suppose. The only difference you're going to notice is that combustion doesn't last as long because of the removal of your artifact's pre-ignited trait. Other than that, though, honestly, it works the same. So let's move on to the gameplay explainer. So Fire's all about Hot Streak. You might be wondering, what is Hot Streak? Well, you've got an ability called Pyroblast. It hits like a truck, but it's got a super long cooldown. But if you get 2 crits in a row, then it causes Hot Streak, which will cause your next Pyroblast to be instant. So you are throwing out fireballs to fish for crits, and then once you get a crit, you're going to get an effect called Heating Up. Getting 1 more crit will turn Heating Up into a Hot Streak. Now, the good news is you've got Fire Blast. Fire Blast always crits. It is used off the GCD, and it can be used while you're mid-cast with another spell. So you use that to secure hot streaks. And overall, what this creates is a very fast-paced spec that's really engaging, and it's helped out by Blizzard doing some custom work in the back end, where if your abilities hit within 0.25 seconds, like say 2 abilities hit but only 1 crits, then your heating up effect isn't cancelled. And this essentially allows for what is called Pyroblast fishing, which is where the spec starts to get really engaging to play. So for the most part, Fire is an excellent example of a reactive spec, and let's just get right into the talents with it. We're going to kick it off with the 15 tier, and that sees Firestarter and Pyromaniac being the same as with Legion, but Conflagration has been moved to the 90 tier to make room for Searing Touch. Now, Searing Touch in BFA is a weaker version of one of your legendary abilities, and it increases Scorch's damage by 150% and makes it a guaranteed crit when the target is below 30% HP, which is pretty damn major. Now, the 30 tier is still utility, with Shimmer and Blast Wave being the same, and Blazing Soul being reworked to give you a fresh Blazing Barrier right after you blink. Then 45 is unchanged, and most of 60 is unchanged, bar Phoenix Flames, which takes the place of Controlled Burn, which, let's be real, it was pretty boring anyway. Now, Phoenix Flames is nice damage, amazing in AoE, but it is also a guaranteed crit, which means it's giving you more control over your core mechanic of Hot Streak. Then 75 is unchanged, as is most of 90, just that Unstable Magic has been removed, with Conflagration taking its place, having moved over from the 15 tier. Then as we move on to the 90 tier, hey, it's also mostly unchanged, but we do see essentially one of Legion's legendaries be added with the Pyroclasm talent, which causes consuming a hot streak to have a 15% chance to make your next non-instant Pyroblast do 300% more damage. And that's actually a pretty cool ability because, well, it changes the pace of the spec in a way that I kind of enjoy, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Overall, though, I just want to sort of bring up, like, what's actually different here? Honestly, not much. There are some rather redundant talents that have been removed in order to make way for 2 popular legendaries and your artifact ability. This means that the Legion gameplay is pretty much preserved for the most part, but there are a few downsides. As an example, choosing between Flame On and Phoenix Flames, I don't think that really feels great. Then I'm really glad to see the Pyroclasm effect be added as a talent. It is a really nice break in pace for the spec, and that sounds like a generic compliment, but I suppose the reason why I like it is that even though it's a big, long, hard cast, you know that during that cast you're recharging your fire blasts, and that feels great. You know, it's like you'll be ready to go ham once it's over. I've also found a few times I was able to line up a pyroclasted pyroblast with combustion, such that I used combustion right before the cast, which led to a tremendous ignite. That was super satisfying, a bit like getting a flurry shattered glacial spike in Frost. So my opinions on the Fire Mage are really as they were in Legion. I love it. I think it's extremely fun to play, and I just love the aggressive feeling of smashing that Fire Blast button, securing your hot streak, chucking out a Pyroblast, and then especially if that one crits, right? And then you can do, secure another crit, get another hot streak. Just the whole fishing for hot streaked Pyroblasts it's such a satisfying mechanic to execute. And it's a really simple one as well. This is a great example of it. Has a small number of abilities with a high level of interactivity between each ability, such that You know, they don't need like a million things on your keyboard to make something that's engaging and fun. And as for the talents, I think they're pretty much fantastic, especially with those legendary effects being added, especially Pyroclasm, which it turns out I really enjoy. Although that said, I will say that the shorter combustion doesn't really feel great. That's the only thing that, to me, does feel like a bit of a notch down from the Legion situation. But overall, Fire, it got a big thumbs up in Legion, and it still gets a big thumbs up in Battle for Azeroth. And then just to round out my opinions on the Mage after all my testing, I think it is still a fantastic class if pure DPS is what you are looking for. It has 3 specs that provide 3 very different gameplay feels, with Fire probably edging out on top for me. My broad opinions, they really haven't changed massively since Legion, which makes sense because these specs have not radically changed. Instead, they've seen tweaks, they've seen adjustments, and these things broadly do seem to be in a good direction. It gives us versions of these specs that function well without their artifacts and should serve as a solid basis for Battle for Azeroth's progression as an expansion. So would I main it? If I wanted pure DPS, perhaps, it's brilliant for that, but I do want to multi-roll with my main, which kind of knocks it out of the running. That said, this absolutely is a class that I am going to keep geared, and I definitely will be dipping in and out of during Battle for Azeroth, which, pretty much for what I'm looking for, that is the highest praise that I can give it. Overall, the Mage is pretty awesome. You just need to know kind of what you're getting into and analyze these specs and think, do I like all of those procs? If I'm okay with proc-based gameplay with a lot of randomness, yeah, I'll probably love Frost. You know, same goes for like the aggressive feel of Fire, or the more considered version of Arcane, because with Arcane, like if you use your abilities wrong, you can mess yourself up for like a minute. So yeah, there's really great gameplay like diversity here, and that should give a lot of people at least 1 or 2 options that they really enjoy. So there you go, that is the Mage class review in BFA. A massive thank you to Icy Veins for helping out with this series and also for sponsoring it. You can check out their Battle for Azeroth Mage content down in the description below, and their full guides will be out for pre-patch. So that is it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.